Hello again. Thank you so much once again for joining us. Let's take a look at this particular issue now. South Africa and China have seen relations between the two countries strengthen over the past few years. Well, China is one of our largest trading partners, so much so that they're willing to have voluntary Mandarin classes in schools. Joining us now is Rodney Man. He's the ex-chairman of the Chinese Association in South Africa, and he also worked in Asia as a business negotiator. He's now retired, but he lectures at Wits Business School and the University of Hong Kong. It's a big pleasure to have you with us. Good morning.
Good morning, Amanda.
Let's begin first by discussing the power dynamics between this relationship of South Africa and China. Some are saying when it comes to trade that it's too lopsided in China's favor. How would you analyze this situation?
Well, firstly, China has always supported the developing countries as it asserted itself over the years, and Africa being no exception. And I do understand that China has had a long-standing relationship with the ANC in particular over the years. And so this development has blossomed now that the new democratic government has come into power over here. China has really developed itself significantly over the last 20 years. After the Tiananmen episode, the Chinese economy was in the doldrums. It was picking itself off from the floor, and it decided to re-establish itself, and it did so very spectacularly. And now that it's got to where it is, I think it sees its role as to assist other countries who are trying to do the same thing. So therefore, China is doing this, but we should also remember that countries do things for not only for the benefit of other countries, they do things for their own benefit as well. So China does see the advantages of doing trade with South Africa. So that's why China is promoting this very, very strongly. And South Africa sees advantages too, I do understand.
Let's talk a little bit about that now. Some of the naysayers would suggest that in picking itself up, that perhaps China is using Africa as a crutch to prop itself, and that once it has taken out whatever it needs from the continent, it will then pull back and leave us to fend for ourselves. One might cite its involvement in Lesotho as an example there. Is there any merit to those who believe perhaps that there's more sinister intention by China to, quote, recolonize Africa, as it were?
I personally don't believe that. I was speaking as a South African, not as a Chinese, although I'm of Chinese extraction. I do see China really doing things around the world for its own benefit. It started cultivating trade very strongly with the West, because that was the natural market for all the consumer products that China has been churning out over the years. And having achieved a large measure of success in doing this, China then looked at sources of raw material. And it's looked at this all over the world. It's looked at Africa, it's looked at Australia, it's looked at South America, it's looked at Southeast Asia. And it's doing something very similar all over. So I think Africa is no exception to what China is doing. And I don't think there is any intention for colonization, because if I know the average Chinese person, having worked there for so many years, they are very happy staying and working in China. They go abroad just to find more opportunities, and then they go back home.
Do you think it's worth perhaps my children and their children learning Mandarin? I mean, China's been dubbed the world's second largest economy. It's making waves. We know US President Barack Obama has made warnings to Africa and other areas, against China. So it's definitely on the rise. Is it worth investing in our children perhaps learning Mandarin as perhaps the next language of business?
Let me quote my own example. I came from South Africa. I was posted to work in the East, in China specifically, for many years. I knew basic Cantonese, which was the southern dialect of Chinese, not the main official language. I knew very little Mandarin. And having got there, I decided that I should learn Mandarin because it would get me closer in touch with the people I'm dealing with. So I set about learning Mandarin over there, and today I can speak passable social Mandarin, not really business Mandarin, but enough to get by, to introduce myself, to have a chat. And the Chinese really appreciate that if you can make an attempt to speak their language, and they warm to you, and so you begin to cultivate relationships, and those relationships are the basis for establishing long-lasting permanent relationships whereby you can build trade upon this, you can build social and cultural interchanges upon this, and so forth. So I found that learning Mandarin was an absolute advantage. And I think people all over the world are finding that. In many countries around the world, Chinese is being offered as an additional language. And over here too, I know there's been a lot of emotion and politicking about this issue, but if you look at the issue of Chinese in schools, it's just an additional language to the other 13 which are being offered as additional second languages. So it's just an additional language added. It's voluntary. It's really up to you if you want to learn it or not. If you don't want to learn it, that's great. So it just gives better options to people. Now, many people will say there are other things to address in terms of basic education in South Africa, and I've got no dispute with that, and many people, and the government themselves, I think, would agree with that, but doesn't mean you have to stop choices for people who want to learn languages. So treat it as an additional language. I mean, there are 5 European languages and a number of Indian languages, for instance, all in the same pool as Mandarin. So I don't see any issue, basically.
Sticking with current affairs that are related to China, we can't ignore what's happening in the markets. It's been dominating headlines as well. A very interesting piece of information that I had learned about this ordeal, because it can get terribly confusing to ordinary South Africans such as myself, but that the nature of the Chinese markets are such that they're called retail markets or retail shares or something to that effect, and that they're predominantly owned by locals there and not your large corporates like in South Africa, and perhaps that has got something to do with the volatility. Perhaps in about 30, 40 seconds or so, could you just quickly give us an outline of why things are so different there in China when it comes to markets?
I think the issue with China is that the markets are semi-controlled. The big issue in China is the absolute free flow of information. And a lot of information is certainly available, but a lot of it is not freely available that you can put your stamp on. So therefore, the average Chinese person does a lot of interpretation of the information he gets. He decides whether he should trust this source of information. He decides whether he should trust the government when they make pronouncements and so forth. And at the end of the day, the Chinese are basically thrifty persons. And they try and keep the money to themselves because they trust no one. And they will invest if they see an opportunity. If they see things going wrong, the first thing they do is to come back within themselves. So I think this is what's happening. They see a lot of volatility, they see things going up and down, and they think, rather, let us withdraw and keep our money and see what's happening. And this adds to the cycle of ups and downs that you see happening right now.
And so it continues. My thanks to you for joining us. This has been quite an informative discussion. We must do this more often, just catching up on a number of Chinese South Africa current affairs. I'm joined by the lecturer at Wits University Business School and University of Hong Kong, Rodney Man. A very big thank you to you for having joined us. Let's turn our attention to something else.